Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to introduce this panel. We could go on and on about all of their accomplishments, but in the interest of time, we will do an abbreviated introduction. First, we have Dr. Kif Augustine-Adams, who went to BYU as an undergrad and then to Harvard Law School. Ignacio Garcia, professor of history, went to Texas A&I in Kingsville, Texas, as an undergrad, and then went to University of Arizona for his PhD. He preceded me by a couple of years there at Arizona. They made it to the Final Four when he was there, and when I was there, we won the national championship. So I don't know if that says anything, but anyway, on to more important things. DJ Gonzalez went to Southwestern Community College to begin his undergraduate career, then to UC San Diego, and got his PhD at USC. And Jane Lopez got her undergraduate at Stanford University, a master's at Oxford, and got her PhD at UC San Diego. So without further ado, we'll turn our time over to our panelists. Let's give them a hand.
Thank you. Great. Yeah, that's going to work. Okay. I just wanted to, for my presentation, want to go through a series of images. And what this is really meant to kind of spark our thoughts and how we see, or what do we imagine, what do we envision when we hear about the border or when we're watching news coverage about the border. My tendency is to have the feeling that we tend to think of it as a monolith, that it's one thing, that there's this massive space of 2,000, actually I better start my timer, hold on, of roughly 2,000 miles, only 700 of which, where do I point this? There we go. Only 700 of which are actually have some type of barrier, wall, fencing, etc. But it is an incredibly large area. It's not the largest land border in the world. The one north of us along the US-Canada border is actually the largest contiguous land border in the world. But all of our focus is on this one, usually, for some reason. So the border goes kind of in some ways from a coast to coast. This is at San Isidro and Tijuana. The wall literally goes into the ocean, as you can see. It separates major metropolitan regions. This is perhaps, I think, the busiest international border, one of the busiest in the world, definitely in the United States. The commerce that comes through here is 12.1% of all US imports on a yearly basis, just through this port alone. $1.7 billion of commerce occurs through the 47 different points of entry along the US-Mexico border, and roughly 1 million people pass through the various checkpoints along the border. But not too far from San Diego, there's actually desert and near the Imperial Valley. And this part of the fence is actually called the floating fence because it has to move in regards to different types of ecological conditions. It passes through other forms of desert and indeed through indigenous or Native American reservations, indigenous territory, and a national cactus monument. The fencing, the wall, the border goes up into the mountains. Another shot of a major metropolitan region, sadly the site of a recent national tragedy in El Paso, but a community that's had a long binational, bicultural type of existence. Some places the fence just stops, right? Other places it passes through major valleys or ranges. This is part of the Rio Grande area near Santa Elena Canyon, Lajitas, Texas. Also another shot of the Rio Grande. And this is near McAllen, pretty much close to its ending point, near the Gulf of Mexico. And this is another part of the border that really emphasizes the separation of communities. This is Matamoros, Mexico, on the north side of this photo, whereas Brownsville would be on the other side. What these images emphasize, aside from the differing ecology, is that there are several communities, indeed dozens of communities, big and small, but definitely some large metropolitan regions, that have existed along this border, and many of which predated the border. Right? And so we're dealing with social relations and communities that have been for generations, hundreds of years, right? From the 1827 maps of Mexico. And indeed, for thousands of years, right, again, indigenous communities have existed all along this area. So again, how do we see and envision the border? Well, many people try in note of the policy failures, and we'll indeed talk a lot about those policy failures today. Policy is an important part of the conversation, but my concern is when we overemphasize policy, which again, I do study, and I've written a bit on immigration policy, but we tend to lose sight of this deep history and of the fact that at times, right, not too long ago, it didn't exist. So this is an effort to make the border invisible. Other efforts to really question what's going on along the border and who's watching and how does it impact even the next generation. And a lot of what I would like to just emphasize here in regards to the border and policy is really affected by how we view it. Do we view it through this long type of view, right, of people, communities that have existed and crossed it, you know, how the border has indeed separated these communities, not just, you know, in recent years, but, you know, from its initial establishment, you know, after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, there's several series of surveys that began to plan which direction, which route would this go. But oftentimes, whether intended or not, the outcome of policy, the actual impact that it has on people is really shaped by our ability to see the border.
Lo que hace uno en un lado tiene impacto en el otro. Y eso es lo que es un sub y baja. Exactamente eso.
Pues qué triste, ¿no? Porque pues que nos separe algo, una barrera, tanto como de aquel lado hay mexicanos como de acá y de Estados Unidos, y sentir algo así como que, ¿cómo le hacemos para vernos? Y así, pues no.
So as a historian, you know, studying the past has given me a lot of hope in what I've seen, what communities and people power do. And regardless in some ways of the resulting state of how bad or good or however we assess current policy is, there is a future. And the choice and the outcome of our policy can look one way, right? Or it can look another way, right? It can actually bring together. We can make the choice to have policy bring communities together to honor that history as opposed to tear it apart, which does produce harm and death, as the previous slide showed. And indeed, my deepest hope is that if we don't fix it, then maybe the next generation will. So I'm done.
See, I didn't bring any pictures, so you're going to have to just look at me, if that's okay. What I did, as I was thinking about this panel, I started looking at immigration policy throughout a number of presidential administrations. And so I decided to look at a few things that were of interest to me. And so I'm not going to give you a history lesson per se, but in 1924, of course, the Border Patrol was established. You had other entities guarding the border, particularly military before that. But it's the beginning of what we would consider the sort of the wall, the immigration problems. And to come across that border was quite easy. Sometimes you'd have to pay, depending on which border station you decided to cross. And in some places, you had to be bathed in kerosene to be able to come in case you might bring something that was not appropriate. So by we have immigration laws from quite early on. By 27, we begin to look at immigration from Europe. We begin to look at immigration from the United States. And one of the things that the border does, it creates a tremendous amount of conflict within our policymakers and also within our own people. And so you have, at that time, the late 20s, you have growers arguing with nativists about the value of the Mexican worker, right? The grower who looked at the Mexican worker as someone who was docile, someone who was a good citizen, or at least a good resident, and whereas nativists would see them as a threat to the culture and the society of the area. By 1929, we hear the first official sort of declaration of Mexican immigration as an invasion. That's Herbert Hoover, who decides to promote a program that was supposed to be voluntary deportation. Sort of reminds me of now Senator Mitt Romney's concept of self-deportation. If you make things really difficult enough that people will deport themselves. And basically the repatriation was a plan in which people were provided transportation, sometimes a little bit of money so that they'd go home. And of course this was worked out with an arrangement with the Mexican government which promised to welcome the people and give jobs to them. But of course they couldn't because the Depression, and the starting Depression was worldwide. And so repatriation sort of, and there's disagreement on the numbers, but quite a few, maybe as much as 1 million. Would you agree with that, David? 1 million Mexican Americans or Mexicans were deported, with a good chunk of those being American citizens or residents in the Southwest. We see, Franklin Roosevelt, who was our most liberal president at the time, progressive president, and his view was he never talked about, and he never used the words immigration or immigrant, and he never discussed the sort of people migration from the South, but always emphasized the European and how wonderful that migration was for the nation. He was in some ways our first president. I mean, well, there's other nativist groups before that, but in terms of someone significant, he does look at immigration from Europe as a way to build this great country, but not migration from other places. And so he maintains a strong sort of view. And in fact, some scholars have seen his stand on immigration probably to the right of a number of politicians today who engage in border issues. After Roosevelt, we hear the word invasion again in the Harry Truman administration. And that is, Harry Truman is the first president to set a commission. There had been congressional hearings on the immigrant problem, the Mexican problem before, but Harry Truman was the first president to then set up a presidential commission to go and study the problem. And the report says there's an invasion coming from Mexico, and we need to do that. And so Harry Truman then begins what would come to be Operation Wetback, which Eisenhower would take to the next level. There, 2 to 3 million Mexican Americans, residents of the United States, are deported, and that's the first real major breakup of families, and that's the first time that you see massive raids in the barrios of the Southwest and the Midwest to be able to capture and then deport Mexicans from this country. And it is very traumatic because some communities like Detroit had, interesting enough, in the 40s, a very vibrant Mexican community. It's pretty much, that community is pretty much destroyed, and it would take years to rebuild. There's a lot of, but there's also a tremendous amount of fear that arises from that. And it has a real social impact among the Mexican American community. And that is thousands of parents who will say, no more Spanish in the home, and tell their kids, and in a very traumatic way, their kids not to speak Spanish. And so you begin to see after World War II the first generation of Mexican Americans who do not know the language very well. That also, deportation, leads to the first major conflict among Mexican American reformers an activist over whether the border is a barrier or whether the border remains what it's always been, so a place you cross back and forth. And so there is tremendous amount of political conflict there, and to the point where organizations such as the American GA Forum, which in its history is known one of the great sort of defenders of the Mexican American and Mexican community, promotes deportation and works with the Border Patrol to round up as many Mexicans as they can, because their view is they're stealing jobs from Mexican Americans. That proves not to be true, but nonetheless, it divides the activist community. So Operation Wetback is one of the most destructive campaigns against Mexicans in this country. We will go on, and immigration policy sort of, and you'll have legal expert here who will tell you a little bit more about immigration policy there. But we get to President Nixon. President Nixon has what he calls Operation Jobs. And what's so interesting about that is that there's almost nothing written on that. But I experienced that as a young man who had been newly married to a young woman from Mexico. Of course, I was from Mexico too, but she was more recent. And we used to live in this sort of large immigrant community, most of it undocumented. And every other night we would hear the raids and the sirens and people running and Border Patrols chasing them. And so it's very interesting that we've not done enough on Operation Jobs, which again was a very traumatic. It was also one of the sort of continuing to divide families. Of course, we have Ronald Reagan, who is best known for amnesty. I'm providing amnesty to about 3 to 5 million people. But he also is the one who starts pushing for verification and the idea of finding the companies and corporations and factories that will hire people. And he also increases the number of Border Patrol by 50%. And so there's a give and take. But with the idea that the amnesty program was that this would be the finality to the problems with undocumented. There would be no more attempts to resolve the issues of immigration. Of course, that fails miserably. George Bush then, who is probably the most, quote, enlightened president in dealing with border issues, coming from as governor of Texas. But he also develops a program that would be better known under the Obama administration, which was Secure Communities. And Secure Communities was an attempt to work with local law enforcement, to try to work with agencies. And the idea was that if you had these undocumented workers who were criminals, who had engaged in crimes, that then those would be the first ones to deport. He was only able to establish the program in 14 jurisdictions. When President Obama came in, he came in with a promise that in the first year of his presidency, we would have immigration reform, which that follows him even till today, because he did absolutely nothing for immigration reform. And he then took the Secure Communities, 14 jurisdictions, and turned it into 1,100 jurisdictions, and engage with all kinds of law enforcement agencies. And his top person on immigration was quoted as saying, "We will have an ICE agent in every jail in this country, and we're going to, do this." Well, 88,000 families are separated under President Obama's administration. He was very efficient at things he did, and he was very efficient. So the first massive destructions of families occurs during that administration. And so he gets the name as Deporter-in-Chief. Now, there's probably a lot of Deporters-in-Chiefs before him. He just happens to be much more efficient. And of course, then we have today Donald Trump, who's now been known sort of as separating children from their families and engaging as a really incredibly difficult rhetoric. But what's so important to know that is that the view toward undocumented, toward immigrants, has been the same. There's been a few changes in shade, but most of our policy has been very hard on undocumented families. We have never seen people coming from Mexico, even during the Mexican Revolution, which sent 1 million refugees. We never saw them as refugees. We never talked about asylum for them. The idea was they were just people crossing the border. And at the time, we could absorb them because the agricultural revolution was beginning to explode throughout the Southwest and the West. But we never saw them, so they had no rights as refugees, as asylum seekers, which was probably not an issue, but that's exactly what people were doing. So we've always had the same idea, and those kinds of ideas have also split our community. So there's at least 20% of all Latinos in this country who don't believe that people should be given opportunities to cross the border or to resolve their immigration status. And so the whole issue of immigration policy has created what President Trump hasn't been able to do, and that is a real border, a real division among people and among countries. And I think, as our colleagues will explain in more sort of modern terms, I think we need to keep in mind that history of immigration and the border. Thank you.
So I'd like to begin by acknowledging a border that we all have crossed today, that we are on the historic lands of the Ute and the Paiute people, and our presence here was not consented to by them, but we are here on their territorial lands. If you are a Latter-day Saint Gospel Doctrine attender on Sundays, you know that we've been focused on the New Testament. And I see much of what the New Testament has to tell us as an example of how to build bridges, as how to move past the walls of difference. We get that in Romans with all of the teachings there about, can't you just get along? Don't reject the people who approach the gospel differently than you do. And as we head to Galatians, I think later this month, I'd like to read Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Greek, neither is there bond nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. And I hope that is the vision of community, of human community, that we can keep in mind as we think about borders and walls. So how many of you have crossed the border between Mexico and the United States, either going that way or coming this way? So you're familiar at least with some of the pictures that Dr. Gonzalez put up. Last December it was, I went to Tijuana to volunteer with a group called Al Otro Lado, which is helping asylum seekers figure out whether or not crossing into the United States would be a good choice for them in their life. And so it was before the Remain in Mexico policy was put in place by the Trump administration. But it was at a time when metering was starting, where people had to go and put their name on a list to be able to be allowed to present themselves at 2 U.S. border guards in order to enter the United States. So they were getting in line in the way that they were told to get in line. And I spent a couple of days there talking with people, helping prepare them for credible fear interviews in the United States, helping them think about whether or not their options here would be, whether or not the law would recognize their potential claim. And the day that I crossed back over, I crossed at San Isidro, Chaparral West, and I just felt so awkward because right by where I was walking back and forth across was the tent where the list that was maintained by the migrants themselves people had to sign up for. And so I'd gone there and watched people. But here I was with my little blue, roller suitcase, and I could just walk across, right? Nobody said anything to me. They didn't stop me. They didn't, even when I had to show my passport, they hardly took it, barely glanced at it, and I could just walk through. And so I felt acutely the privilege and the sort of the privilege that I had, and that awkwardness. So I come from a practice of law, and I think about law as a scaffolding for both bridges and for walls. But I also recognize that construction of anything takes a lot longer than destruction. And it's easy to blow things up, but it takes a lot more effort and work to construct things. So in this architecture of law, Dr. Garcia explained some of the history of immigration law in the United States, but I want to talk about some of the structure of law that's been dismantled in the last several years. So we have the Refugee Act of 1980 that codifies the ad hoc approach to allowing refugees to enter the United States that had started post World War II. We also have what's called the Flores Settlement. The Flores Settlement was an agreement between the government and plaintiffs they started in California on behalf of detained migrant children. And that Flores Settlement in the 1990s set the parameters for how and when children crossing the border alone could be detained. Because those children had been detained in really very terrible conditions for extended periods of time. We also have the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act in 1996, and that created a new structure for removing individuals from the United States called expedited removal and a credible fear process. Over the course of time, the Board of Immigration Appeals, immigration judges had created, and circuit courts in the United States, had created a set of laws, a set of interpretations, of approaches that created a structure of law in the United States. Over the course of the last several years, I perceive that basis for asylum law, those basic protections for people seeking to enter the United States has largely been dismantled. So over the last several years, we've had limits on people's ability to apply for asylum. The most recent one, they're actually calling it an asylum ban. And what that means is if you pass through a third country after leaving your home country, to enter the United States, you have to have applied for and been denied asylum in any of those countries before you're eligible to apply for asylum in the United States. And that's a very significant restriction of the right to claim asylum ensconced in the Refugee Act of 1980. We have the Remain in Mexico policy itself, which I think is I refuse to call it the Migrant Protection Protocol, which is its official name, because there's really nothing about protection for migrants in the policy. But it requires people who otherwise in the past would have been allowed to pursue their asylum claim in the United States to go back to Mexico and stay there until their claim is heard in the United States. And then there's been several situations in which the Attorney General of the United States has taken a case that's been on appeal through the regular immigration court system and to the Board of Immigration Appeals, has taken it, which the law in fact allows him to do, but has taken that and made I want to call it an executive decision, but it's not technically an executive decision, but has changed the law that the Board of Immigration Appeals and the immigration courts have worked out over the course of time to a much more restrictive law. One of those is limits on what's defined as a particular social group that allows one to be eligible for asylum, and limiting that so that domestic violence and other forms of gender-based violence no longer count for asylum claims. Thankfully, there were some regulations that were proposed to change the Flores settlement to basically say that kids could be detained forever in whatever sort of circumstances they existed. And thankfully, last week, the judge who was also the judge on the original Florida settlement in the 1990s disallowed the government's change to those regulations. So as we use law, as we create policy, I hope that we can use it to build bridges and not walls, and that our constructive efforts will be productive in recognition of our oneness in Christ and our fellow humanity.
So I wanted us to think a little bit about what does this mean for us? What does this mean for members of the BYU community, for those of us who are living quite far away from the border? I think before I moved here, I could see the border out of the window of my apartment. And so that proximity made what was happening at the border very real for me in ways that it's hard to feel when we're so far away. But I want us to think about how the walls of these laws, of this policy, of our social norms and values have been constructed in our communities here today. And I want you to walk away thinking today not only about how there's a crisis at the border, but there's a crisis in our community today because of the immigration and border enforcement policies that we are allowing to be enforced in our communities. And I wanted you to think first about some of those different walls. One of the things I was thinking about is we hear a lot of people say, well, I believe in doing things the right way, or I believe in obeying the law of the land. And I won't ask for a show of hands to see how many of you always use your turn signal before you change lanes, or always drive at or under the speed limit, or a million other civil laws that regulate our lives that we can often easily ignore. It's unfair if we are willing to support only the laws that are never going to apply to us. And I think it's important to think about how expecting someone to do something the right way can sound really easy when you, by the lucky accident of your birth, automatically did things the right way and can walk right through that border, just like Kif explained. By making that claim and saying, well, do things just the right way, and we can talk for a minute about what happens when you do things the right way, we tend to feel a little bit more righteous than the people who didn't obey the law, right? Than the people who didn't wait in line. And I think that's a false comparison for us to make. So I want you to think about that. We also make social and economic distinctions that build walls in our community. And we often are not actively contributing to building these walls, but we are complicit in their construction when we don't speak up and tell other people that what they're saying is hurtful and is wrong. When we say things or expect things like for people to speak English when in the U.S., and expressing that frustration at someone who's not speaking English, even though we don't have an official language here in our country, or when we assume that somebody who doesn't speak English is not as smart as we are, when we make assumptions about that all Latinos are Mexicans, when we make assumptions that all Mexicans work in low-paid, heavy labor jobs, we build distinctions between us and others that are completely false. My husband's Mexican, and we went on vacation to New York a few years ago. And someone who came up to us in Washington Square asked where he was from. He said, I'm from Mexico. And he said, I've never seen a Mexican who looks like you before. And even if that was meant to be a compliment, that was a brick in a wall dividing us from them. When we assume that all immigrants are here without authorization, or that they broke some law, or that they don't belong here merely because they weren't born here, we are constructing walls, and we're ignoring the very important history that we've just heard of what immigrants have and continue to contribute to our country. And like Kif acknowledged, we ignore that those of us who are not Native Americans have also crossed borders, and almost always without authorization, and have wreaked much greater destruction than anything that we might expect our immigrant community is causing today. And when we feel like immigrants are invading our community, our country, or our way of life, we're making an assumption that this land is ours to begin with, and that this country is ours to decide who gets to belong and who doesn't. Dr. Garcia also mentioned that we're separating families, and there are families in our communities who are being actively separated by our immigration laws today. Deportations happen every day. It might not be as visible as the family separations that are happening at the border, but our government has been actively involved in separating families for generations, and that has not stopped. And I'd be happy to talk to you sometime about my own experience of family separation while we are trying to do things the right way. There are laws that we have in place today are punishing rather than facilitating family togetherness, which is something that I believe goes against our deepest values, both in terms of our faith tradition and in terms of our purported guiding principles as a country. And these are just some of the ways that we construct walls here. And there are ways that we can stop that. And the first thing I would say is, whenever you hear someone expressing these thoughts, say something. And we have this little handout that we prepared for you for some resources for how you can build bridges right here in our community. The first thing I would say is seek out people whose experiences are different from yours, and then listen to them before you decide you know what the right answer is. And then engage in conversation with people who have a different opinion from you. Let them listen, and you listen to them, and begin to build bridges so that we can see that as a community we are better and we are stronger when we support all of the members of our community, and we don't work to deny them access to their right to an education, to affordable health care, to be our neighbors. The other thing I'll say is just that we have the capacity to be bridge builders, and we have many opportunities right here at BYU, even if we might feel like we don't. I just happened to be reading in Ephesians 2 this morning, and now my phone is not gonna. And this is what it said. But now in Christ Jesus, ye who sometimes were far off are made nigh by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace, who hath made both one, and hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us. For through him we both have access by one Spirit unto the Father. Now therefore ye are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints in the household of God. Imagine if that were our rallying cry. in these days to break down the walls that separate us. If we were funneling billions of dollars toward the destruction of a wall and toward the construction of communities on both sides of the border, imagine what our country would be like today. I want to instill in you that hope, as DJ said, that there is hope. We can live in that community without a wall, but we're not going to get there without making the effort. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll now invite questions from the audience. We ask you to come up to the microphone over here because there are, just to make sure everyone hears your question, we're also recording this, and so we want to hear both the question and the response. So please come, tell us your name, what you're studying, and then give us your question. We know in a few minutes, we tend to, and some of you will have to leave to go to class. Please do so as quietly as you can, and we will continue on at least till the top of the hour if there are questions. So please.
So my name's Kyle Andelin. I'm studying economics, and I just wanted to ask what are some changes in policy that you would think of implementing to heal the situation both on like a community, like a family level, and also as a country.
I would go back to policies that were in place before Barack Obama instituted family detention and allow families to pursue their asylum claim in the United States. And if we need supervision of those people, then we can do programs like the monitoring programs that existed before, which were substantially cheaper than family detention and less than a tenth as much as family detention costs. And also people show up for court. They generally do. And so the justification for detaining families is not a good justification, I don't think. And I also think it's wrong to use children as pawns to try and get their parents to comply. So that would be one of the big things, stop family detention.
I would like to see a policy that asks us all to really consider our role in what type of problem we identify is happening with migration. For example, our own consumption choices, the things that we purchase, how we consume, who we ask to trim the trees in our neighborhood, etc. And that we really see our own implications in what is the bedrock of our economy, the exploitation of labor. If we think that's wrong, and we want to pursue policy that doesn't do that, then immigration policy is going to be connected to everything else. It's going to be connected to the type of wage laws that we have, labor protections we have, all sorts of stuff like that. So it's more of it's not necessarily a specific policy, but an ask that we really consider our own role, because we're often asking immigrants to, whether they're legal or not, to consider their role and the harm that they're producing or they're contributing to, and then they have to pay some type of restitution. My point is there's restitution for all of us, right, to have to consider in order if we're going to make changes that do not cause the type of harm that I think we really see as harmful.
I guess I would, suggestion I would have is something that the Wall Street Journal had in the early 1970s, and that it says a slightly regulated open border. That is where people can come, can work, and go. I was talking to then Senator Jeff Flake, and he talked about living in this big ranch that his family owned, and his job in the ranch was to go with his horse, turn out to the furthest border of the ranch and wait for the immigration or the border patrol to come, and then he would write like Paul Revere telling, the migra is coming, the migra is coming. And so it was really interesting to hear a Republican senator say that. But what he said was, when people could come and go back, most people did. Most people left. He said once we made it very difficult and we started tightening the border and militarizing it, then of course people were staying. And some were staying because they had to stay, because they couldn't cross and hope to cross back and not be captured. And he said, and so families could come, they did what they did, and they left back home. And he said, and we never had a problem with people overstaying. Now that's probably not 100% accurate, but the notion was we let people work, we let people who need employers, and then talk about all these labor laws and whatever to protect them. So that, I think, would be a way we can begin to deal with and also create two real neighbors that we always talk about. Mexico and the U.S. are neighbors, and we're very close to each other, and we depend on each other, but we truly don't when we create these very rigid borders.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is, like, there's not one policy that's going to heal everything, but I think if we shifted our approach from punishment to support, right? What if we sought first to support families rather than punish them? What could that policy look like, and what would be the kind of natural outcomes of an approach that is more charitable rather than full of judgment and suffering? So I think that it will require not just a change in policy, but in the way that we think about policy, the role of policy, and how we construct it.
Hi, my name's Caleb Cox. I'm studying anthropology. My question is what kind of effects are our policies having on the Mexican government and the communities within the Central America and South America? Correct me if I'm wrong. A huge reason why a lot of these people come is to support their families that are completely economically bad, to send money back to their families in their countries, to support them there. Is that create like a reliance, like the government has a reliance on this illegal immigration, or like what are the effects that our policies on the other governments that have the people immigrating here?
Well, one of the effects, there's a number of effects. One is by having the kind of policies we have that separates families, that makes it difficult, as Jane would could really explain to us how difficult it is sometimes to bring a family. What you do is you have communities in Mexico and Central America that are devoid of men. And because of the lack of men, there's also a lack of economic development in many communities. It also means that governments down there are establishing policy, not what's good for them, but how to get away from, or how to avoid having a problem. You know, very recently when Mexico had to deal with the issue of being forced to take Central Americans back, when we sent them back from the border, we said, okay, you wait for your asylum call over there. Mexico had to do it because of the economic threats that were coming in. So even policy is impacted in these countries. And so there's a lot of social disruption there. Whereas if people could come work and go back, you'd have communities where you would have the families intact, or they would come here, live, or go back. And so there is a lot of chaos because of immigration policy that we have here.
Yeah, and what you point out is an issue throughout the world. You know, this is global economic inequality, and we see throughout the world, you know, Northwestern Europe is dealing with similar types of problems and very reactionary responses to their migration, which is coming from different parts of the world. But we do have a global economic system that is incredibly dependent on unequal relationships between nations and between people. And so getting to the previous question, which I think your answer responds to and what I'll tap into, is if we can't restructure the whole global economy, and we realize essentially what we're forcing is long, very long commutes to work, right? What's a way to then facilitate that, right? To realize that we need this labor, we want it, we're not going to change our behavior. And so how do we make it easier for someone in Honduras or some other part of Mexico or another part of the world, because only half of the current undocumented immigration population, less than half is from Mexico. And the highest forms of migration right now are coming from Asia and Africa, in addition to the Northern Triangle of Central America. How do we facilitate that movement then if we're not going to structurally change anything else?
The U.S. government has a very specific responsibility for the violence that's happening in El Salvador now based on policies from the 1960s and 1970s. And El Salvador is the one that I'm most familiar with, but just the cycle of violence and support for authoritarian regimes in Central American countries created, supported, facilitated civil war in those countries, which then also sent people migrating to the United States to escape the violence. And then a lot of young men, El Salvadoran young men in the 60s and 70s, when they got incarcerated for forming gangs in Los Angeles to resist the Mexican mafia gangs, then they get radicalized in jail in the United States, and then they get deported back to El Salvador, and the fuel, the cycle of violence just keeps happening. Violence, migration, violence, migration, violence, migration. But U.S. policies long-term since 50s, 60s, 70s have significantly affected rates of violence and policies in those countries.
Hello, I'm Eric Rees-Bybee. I'm a professor here. My question is about a recent development that I heard about on the news, which all of you can, and I think especially Professor Augustine-Adams could probably speak toward, which is the policy of sending back essentially all asylum seekers, whether they're from Bangladesh or wherever, to I think Honduras and El Salvador to await asylum decisions there. And I'm just wondering, I know that BYU has a refugee and immigration initiative that sends law students to work with these asylum seekers. What will be the impact on these women and really on children who are incarcerated with this new policy?
So we'll be going next week down to the South Texas Family Residential Center, which is actually a jail for women and children, migrants. And in the past, this is the fifth time that I'll be going, about the ninth time that the law school has gone or sent people. And what the work that we're going to do is going to be very different than it has in the past, because they're not, the asylum seekers are not actually being taken to the detention center. They're being left in or forced to return to the streets of Ciudad Juarez and other places along the border where they are not safe. And it doesn't matter where you're from, you have to go back to Mexico, or, I mean, if you can go back to Honduras, then maybe you could do that. But the southern border is not just a place where people from Mexico and Central America come. It's also the route for Bangladeshis and Haitians and Cameroonians and people from the Democratic Republic of Congo, for people from Turkey, from people from Syria. You can get a flight into Panama and then come up, or you can take a ship to Panama or Honduras and then come up. But all those populations are largely in Mexico now, and so the work that we will be doing is not preparing women for their credible fear interviews with an asylum officer as the first step in getting out of detention to then pursue their asylum claim. We'll be doing other things because the women are just not there anymore. And in fact, I brought a copy of a lawsuit that was filed on September 16th, challenging the credible fear process in the South Texas Family Residential Center as well, because the rules for credible fear have changed in an unofficial way, and almost nobody is getting a positive decision on their credible fear claim. Okay? And all of these things sending people back to danger in Mexico, that runs afoul of our commitments under international law to not send people back to places that they are, where they're in danger.
Yeah, the one thing I would add to that is that these changes also should challenge our narrative of do things the right way, because basically what this new policy is saying is that there is no right way. You're just not allowed to seek asylum anymore. And so believing that there is a right way and that these laws were designed, to do things in an orderly manner, but without targeting or punishing specific people is a false narrative.
Yeah, for the vast majority of people in the world, there is no line for them to get into, to enter the United States legally. And even that migrant, that metering that's happening at the border, that is a line, but those people are not in a position to actually, most of them, remain in the United States over the long term.
Hi, my name is Braden Richards. I'm an Asian Studies and Japanese major. Earlier you spoke to the point about how our conception of the border kind of defines what policy we put in place or how we visualize the border. As someone who's from Seattle and doesn't necessarily have a direct connection with the border, what are some tips possibly about how I could reconceptualize the border in a healthier way or in a more positive way to be able to kind of, hopefully in the future, impact and influence policy?
You could take any number of the classes listed on the syllabus, not the syllabus, but this wonderful sheet. There's a tremendous amount of resources there. I mean, just even on your own to educate yourself. We listed podcasts, websites, all sorts of resources there. There are student groups, on campus. They're involved with serving the local Latino or Hispanic community. You could do that. I think the most effective way is, as was mentioned before, I forget who mentioned it, but building friendships, building relationships, getting to know people, even if they're not from Latin America, but somewhere else, another culture and another nation. I mean, that changes our perspective as we learn to really appreciate and see the humanity in someone else, and then we start to see how policy affects them or how they've experienced it.
One of the other ways you can do that is by studying the immigrant history in Washington. Washington, the Northwest, has a big, long history of people coming up. What has happened, and Professor Oscar Martinez, who was at one time premier Borderlands scholars, used to argue that the border has moved up to Minneapolis, that so many of the conditions and the same contentions and juggling for jobs and for legal protection and for staying away from ICE and the Border Patrol, what would used to be the Border Patrol, is occurring throughout the Midwest, the Northwest. And so one way of sort of being sensitive to that is to look at that history, and there's some very good work done on the Northwest and immigrants there. And I think that brings it home. You realize that these border issues have come to almost every corner of American society.
Hi, my name is Elton Bradford. I'm a Middle East Studies and Arabic major, and I'm also co-director of the chapter of Their Stories, Our Story at UA campus. And my question for all of you is actually specifically about comments recently that you might have been aware of that the director of Operation Underground Railroad made, Tim Ballard, when he's had many appearances on Fox News and even meetings with other agents and people working against human trafficking at the White House. And he's made a lot of arguments for the border wall to be reinforced or continuously built in order to deter sex traffickers of children coming across the border, since America is one of the biggest, has some of the biggest demand for child sex in the world. I just wanted to know what your feelings are about that, if this is a strong argument or if we're talking about the wrong thing here.
Well, I think what I just say is that most of the illegal drugs that are coming across our borders are not being carried by people in backpacks who are walking across the desert, but they're coming through the ports of entry that already exist. And I think that that's true about the vast majority of sex trafficking and child sex trafficking that's happening as well. And so it's not about building a barrier. We can see, El Chapo was pretty good at finding ways to get around those barriers, as have many other people. And so I don't think that problem is going to stop. I think DJ keeps mentioning this idea of demand and of us reevaluating how we contribute to these problems. He's thinking about, like our consumer decisions, but a wall isn't going to stop the demand for sex trafficking in the U.S. when we're not addressing the other problems that are happening. And I think because of that, there will be new innovations and new technologies to traffic people if we build a wall.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen the Aeromexico ad of a plane flying over a border, the border wall. A wall is not going to stop. Is not going to stop it. It's an incredibly expensive, inefficient way of countering trafficking. And we could use the money that would be spent for a border wall in much more effective ways to limit sex trafficking. I don't know if you've in the Salt Lake Airport now, and in lots of different airports in Phoenix, there are signs in bathrooms about call this number if you're being trafficked, but at least the ones that I've seen are all in English in Salt Lake, and they need to be in lots of different other languages as well. We can, limiting and preventing sex trafficking can be, or any sort of human trafficking requires us to pay attention in lots of different ways. If you are aware of a situation that might involve trafficking, call Carlos Esqueda, who is the Assistant U.S. Attorney in Salt Lake, focused on trafficking issues. And I mean, it's unfortunate to have to say this, but there is significant trafficking in Utah. The I-15, I-80 corridors are significant corridors for trafficking. There are practices within our larger community that suggest that allow and facilitate trafficking in really unfortunate ways. There was a woman recently arrested in the Philippines at an airport with a baby, 4 or 5 day old baby in her suitcase. She made it all the way through all sorts of security to the point where they were inspecting her bags at even after she'd gone through to show her passport. And she's from Sandy. Right, she lived in Sandy, and one of the news reports that I read about that was that she had told the parents, or it was unclear exactly what, if the parents were together or not together, but a very young mother, one of the things the mother wanted was that her baby would be sealed to a family. And so it was sort of preying on both financial and spiritual vulnerabilities to traffic that child. And there was another case recently where an individual in the greater Salt Lake area was sponsoring students to come to the U.S. and then essentially holding them as slaves and exploiting them. So be aware. A wall is not going to stop it. These people were Philippines, Thailand. There's no wall that can be built there, and building a wall across the southern border isn't going to stop it. It's not an effective way.
Yeah, let me add to that real quick. One of the resources on this sheet is the Pew Research Center. You can find the stats and the data there that shows specifically that the long effort, at least the decades-long effort to build the wall, that 700 miles has mostly been produced over the last generation or so, 25, 30 years-ish. And all that does has increased the role of the cartel and made it more dangerous. It's also most of the undocumented, those that become undocumented in the country now come actually through visas, and they come through the air as opposed to crossing that border. So again, in regards to just those problems, the militarization, as it's been termed, of the border doesn't work.
Hi, my name is Emma Glebe. I'm actually a neuroscience major, minoring in political science, and just kind of paying attention to a lot of what's going around media currently, especially with kind of presidential rhetoric surrounding a border wall and then the census, has kind of piqued my interest in understanding like how that dynamic works. And so I more specifically wanted to ask about some clarification for like Nixon era immigration policies, because my understanding looking into the history of the census and building, kind of constructing like a Latino Hispanic group identity was that Nixon was kind of a catalyst for that. So that is, I would love some more kind of information in understanding that and how it might still affect policy today and attitudes.
Well, one of the efforts why the Nixon administration becomes partly responsible is because they need a category. They're not finding much success in sort of counting the Hispanic population at the time. So they come up, they get together with corporations and then with the media and with activists who are interested in the number count so that they can, again, gain resources for their community. But in a way, it also becomes a way to track these undocumented communities. And so it's being used both by local communities to get more funding, by activists to be able to get more funding for their own organizations, but also the government is able to identify, and then it begins to interpret it as a problem. So it begins to identify a problem. And so most of what Nixon did was very interesting, but it was always pretty negative at the end. So.
And that wasn't all a top-down effort. I think as Dr. Garcia is explaining, there were various groups, even in the what we now term the Hispanic Latino community, that were in favor of this, particularly those engaged mostly in politics, political organizations, businesses, again, played a role, marketing organizations. There's actually a vast literature on that. So if you're more interested, check, and we can give a list of a few books you can check out that explain how this is really multifaceted. Initially, it was kind of, yes, viewed as this top-down. Nixon just wanted a bunch of Mexicans to vote for him, so he created this category, and it's a bit more complicated than that.
There's a wonderful book titled Making Hispanics. I don't remember the author right now, but it engages the whole, the whole history of the census and Hispanics.